billionaire refused to drive his pregnant wife to the hospital but rushed when Mistress called. There are secrets money can't keep hidden forever, desires that even fortunes can't silence, and betrayals that no amount of gold can mend. Alexander Morgan, a millionaire living in the lap of luxury, had everything a man could possibly want: power, influence, and a gleaming empire that stretched beyond what most people could imagine. Yet in the hours before his child's birth, when his pregnant wife, Catherine, needed him most, he turned his back on her hospital plea. Moments later, he rushed out the door, fueled by the desperate call of his mistress. What happened next unraveled a devastating scandal that would change their lives forever. Alexander Morgan was the sort of man who, from birth, seemed destined for greatness. He was born into the elite Morgan family, whose origins were rooted in the old money circles of Greenwich, Connecticut. The estate he inherited, known simply as Winfield Manor, was a multi-winged structure of polished marble floors and gilded columns. Majestic gardens, meticulously maintained since the days of his grandfather, surrounded the manor with a labyrinth of hedges, exotic flowers, and a gentle fountain that splashed like crystalline raindrops under the sun. To many, the Morgans seemed to have it all: wealth, prestige, and an impeccable reputation. Beneath this refined exterior, however, the Morgans harbored a kind of generational arrogance. Their wealth had bred a sense of entitlement, evident in Alexander's father, Randall Morgan, who never truly listened to the opinions of lesser folk. His mother, Lenora Morgan, was genteel in public but ruthless in private negotiations and family matters. Alexander grew up absorbing these traits. By the time he was 20, he had a cocky demeanor that he wore as comfortably as his tailored suits. He was known for throwing extravagant parties, always with a VIP guest list that included celebrities, politicians, and foreign dignitaries. Rumors circulated about the outlandish sums he spent on rare champagne and caviar. Yet these trivialities paled in comparison to the cunning mind that made him a formidable businessman in his own right. But it was not strictly arrogance that defined him. Alexander had inherited his mother's quick wit and father's relentless ambition. By his mid-20s, he had expanded the family fortune into technology investments, real estate, and even a high-end fashion brand. His name was whispered at exclusive clubs in Monaco and rubbed shoulders with venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. People either loved him or envied him. Either way, they never stopped talking about Alexander Morgan. In this swirl of wealth and status, he encountered Catherine Beaumont, a talented interior designer whose refined artistry had caught the eye of New York's upper crust. She was elegant, with a keen sense of color and an understanding of space that transcended standard design. Her skill attracted Alexander as he sought to renovate Winfield Manor into something new and daring, yet still dignified. A professional relationship was born, and from it sprang a personal connection that neither had anticipated. From the outside, Catherine was everything the Morgan family admired in a potential partner for Alexander: sophisticated, poised, and polished. She came from a modest yet respectable background, and her sense of style was impeccable. Catherine was not a typical gold digger. As people might label a woman who married into money, she had built her own successful design firm, Beaumont and Company, and had a flourishing client base even before crossing paths with Alexander. Their courtship was straight out of a glossy magazine, filled with luxurious trips to Paris, weekends on a private yacht in the Mediterranean, and exclusive dinners at the finest restaurants Manhattan had to offer. As a couple, they were soon featured in society columns, lauded as the latest power duo of the city. Friends speculated about a grand wedding, and indeed, it soon happened at an exquisite ceremony held in the lush gardens of Winfield Manor. under glimmering fairy lights and attended by hundreds of elites. No one suspected the clouds forming on the horizon. Marriage, despite the fairy tale opulence, brought Catherine face to face with the reality of life as a Morgan. Alexander was not an easy husband to please. He had grown up in a household where emotions were seldom shown and conflicts were brushed under expensive rugs. In moments of tension, his solution was to withdraw into his vast office, distracting himself with work or a fresh business opportunity. Catherine, on the other hand, believed in openness and communication. She had grown up with a supportive mother and father, Linda and Gerald Beaumont, who encouraged talking through problems. The Morgan family's tendency to hide issues behind extravagant vacations or lavish gifts was foreign to her. Early in their marriage, small arguments about schedules, social events, and demands of work were resolved quietly, with Catherine often giving in for the sake of peace. She understood Alexander was busy, juggling multiple ventures, but she also believed that once the dust settled, they would learn how to be a strong couple. After all, love had brought them together, and love was supposed to endure. The trouble began when Catherine noticed that Alexander's nights out with business partners became more frequent. He would casually mention a new investor meeting late at night, an impromptu conference with foreign partners, or a glamorous gala in the city he simply had to attend. Yet Catherine, uninvited, was left home alone. She tried to brush off her concerns, reminding herself of how important building connections was to the Morgan legacy. But an unsettling knot formed in her stomach each time Alexander's phone buzzed, especially when he darted out of the room to answer calls in private. She never accused him outright of wrongdoing. She wanted evidence, but more than that, she wanted trust. Some nights, Catherine found herself sitting in their grand living room, the gold-framed mirrors and plush sofas mocking her solitude. She would stare at the clock, each tick echoing the quiet frustration in her heart. Alexander often breezed in after midnight, sometimes smelling of expensive perfume that wasn't hers. When asked, he'd mumble about large gatherings where everyone was wearing different fragrances. Catherine wasn't convinced, but she swallowed her suspicions, determined to maintain her dignity and composure. Family gatherings at Winfield Manor also started to weigh heavily on her. Alexander's mother, Lenora, a rigid woman who believed the Morgan men could do no wrong, would chastise Catherine for any perceived failure. Her attire was never quite right, her table manners not refined enough, or her inability to conceive a child quickly enough to continue the Morgan lineage. Such remarks were painful, but Catherine did her best to smile politely, taking the jabs in silence. Little did Lenora know, Catherine had been yearning for a child as much as Alexander seemed to avoid the subject. In truth, Catherine feared that a child might only further complicate her shaky marriage, but she also clung to the hope that motherhood might bring her and Alexander closer, teach him responsibility, patience, and empathy. It was a gamble she wasn't sure she was ready to take, but fate had different plans. Amid the extravagant dinners and stifled whispers in the mansion's hallways, Catherine discovered she was pregnant. A swirl of emotions engulfed her that day: excitement, anxiety, a flickering sense of triumph. She quickly scheduled an appointment at a private obstetrics clinic in Manhattan, wanting to confirm the news with absolute certainty. There, she met Dr. Gabriel White, a gentle physician who recognized her name. Immediately news traveled fast in society circles. Dr. White confirmed her pregnancy and gave her a long list of guidelines. He stressed the importance of rest, a balanced diet, and emotional well-being. Catherine left with a baby's first ultrasound image, a picture she found herself staring at in a flutter of awe. She slid it into her purse, heart pounding, thinking of the best way to break the news to Alexander. Yet upon arriving home, Catherine found the mansion eerily quiet. She sent a quick text to Alexander. "I have something important to tell you. Please come home as soon as possible." No response came. She waited, pacing the marble floors, replaying every scenario in her mind. Would he be happy? Would he feel burdened? She tried to remain positive, imagining his arms wrapping around her in excitement. He arrived near dawn, exhausted and slightly tipsy. Catherine gently guided him to bed, wanting to postpone the conversation until he could fully absorb the news. That morning, when the first rays of sunlight peeked through the heavy drapes, she placed the ultrasound photo on the breakfast table and mustered all her courage. "Alexander," she began, her voice trembling, "we're going to have a baby." He stared at the ultrasound image for a long moment, blinking in disbelief. There was an emotion fleeting across his face, something close to shock, perhaps fear, maybe even awe. But just as soon as Catherine thought he might smile, a guarded look replaced it. "A baby?" he repeated. "Yes," she answered, reaching out to touch his hand. He cleared his throat, looking away. "That's big news." Are you feeling all right?" His questions were mechanical, lacking warmth. Catherine's heart sank. She tried to stay composed, hoping that once his initial surprise wore off, he'd show excitement. Alexander gave her a quick kiss on the forehead, muttered something about needing time to process, and retreated to his office. Catherine told herself he was just overwhelmed. It had been a late night after all. She decided to give him space, assuming he would come around once the shock subsided. However, for every day that passed, Alexander remained distant. She would find him absorbed in business calls, reading through financial reports, or making plans that excluded her. The only mention of the baby came in passing remarks, usually overshadowed by talk of brand expansions or property deals. Disillusionment began to weigh on Catherine's hope. As months went by, Catherine's pregnancy progressed. Physically, she felt the change's morning sickness that had her rushing to the bathroom, mood swings that she tried to temper around the maids and staff. She found comfort in preparing a nursery, selecting paint colors, and examining different crib designs. Even though Alexander never seemed to care much about the details, it was during this time that a worrying rumor reached Catherine's ears. One of the mansion's staff, Alma, an elderly maid who had worked with the Morgan family for decades, saw the way. Alexander's phone lit up late at night, and how he disappeared for hours, only to return with a guilty tension in his eyes. Alma, sympathetic to Catherine's plight, muttered a warning. "Be careful, Miss Morgan. There is something you should know." Catherine's pulse quickened. She asked what Alma meant, and the maid hesitated. "I've seen him leaving with that woman," Alma finally whispered. A torrent of questions and fears surged in Catherine's mind. Who was she? How long had this been going on? Was Alexander in love with someone else? She recalled how, at the start of her pregnancy, she had once picked up Alexander's phone only to see a text message from a certain Elena Parker. She had dismissed it, thinking it was a business partner or an associate in one of his many ventures. But that name started to echo in Catherine's thoughts more persistently now. She also remembered the expensive perfume that clung to Alexander's suit's perfume that was definitely not hers. Rather than confronting him immediately, Catherine attempted to gather evidence. One evening, she went to Alexander's office under the pretense of asking for help with financials for the nursery. While he was showering, she found his phone on the table, still unlocked. Guilt gnawed at her, but she pressed on, afraid of what she might discover. At first, she saw emails regarding property developments and a chain of hotels he was investing in. But then, a series of messages on an encrypted app drew her attention. Elena Parker, I miss you. Can we meet? Alexander, tomorrow night. Hotel Royale, same suite. Catherine nearly dropped the phone. Her chest tightened and her vision blurred with tears. So it was all true. Her husband, the father of her unborn child, was seeing another woman, arranging nights together in secret. The betrayal was laid out in black and white. Yet, for reasons she could barely articulate, Catherine slid the phone back onto the table, locked the screen, and left the office in silence. A swirl of emotions consumed her: rage, despair, heartbreak, a fierce protective instinct for the child in her womb. She chose not to confront Alexander that night, fearing an emotional outburst could harm the baby. The next morning, Catherine tried to appear normal. She forced a polite smile at breakfast, though she felt as if the mansion's high ceilings were closing in on her. Alexander barely acknowledged her, his eyes glued to a business newspaper. She realized he was always present physically, but mentally far away, perhaps with Elena Parker. Catherine decided she would demand answers, but only after carefully weighing her options. She had to think about her future, her child's future, and the immense power Alexander wielded. Would he try to wrest custody from her if things turned bitter? Could she survive if she walked away from this marriage, losing the life of comfort she'd grown accustomed to? In moments of clarity, Catherine reminded herself that she had been successful before Alexander came along. She had her own design firm, which she had placed on temporary hold during the pregnancy. Maybe she could revive it. She also had supportive parents, Linda and Gerald, who would help if she decided to stand on her own 2 feet. But the emotional toll was crushing. She had loved Alexander, or at least the version of him he once showed her. Days turned into weeks, and her belly continued to grow. She had frequent checkups with Dr. White, whose gentle voice and kind demeanor brought her some solace. He urged Catherine to avoid stress, explaining how anxiety could affect the baby's development. She nodded obediently, though stress was all she seemed to feel these days. At times, Catherine nearly lost herself in fantasies of a perfect family, imagining Alexander would come clean, repent, and make amends. Other times, she grew numb, too exhausted to engage in any arguments or illusions. She still cooked dinner for them both, hoping to share a meal, but Alexander usually arrived too late or dismissed her efforts with a curt, "I've already eaten." Alma, noticing Catherine's deteriorating emotional state, would bring her calming teas and gently remind her to rest. "You are too kind, Alma," Catherine whispered one night. "Thank you for caring." One day, as Catherine was flipping through design magazines in the living room, Alexander's phone rang. His personal phone. He was in the study, so she picked it up out of reflex. The screen displayed Elena Parker. A wave of nausea hit. She didn't answer, but the phone continued to ring, the vibration resonating ominously through the silence. When Alexander emerged moments later, she handed him the phone without a word. He snatched it from her, scowling, and walked out of the room to take the call privately. From that point on, Catherine knew that any illusions she held about a husband devoted to their child were just that, illusions. She decided that if Alexander would not choose his family, she needed to prioritize herself and her baby. Catherine was well into her 3rd trimester when the drama reached its devastating climax. She was heavier, slower, her back aching from the extra weight. Dr. White had warned her of the possibility of early labor, given the stress levels. She tried to remain calm, focusing on last-minute touches to the nursery, a pastel-themed room with plush carpets and a hand-carved crib. The night it all unraveled began innocently enough. Catherine was alone in the mansion. The staff had retired to their quarters, and she was reading a parenting book in the living room. Alexander was out, apparently at a business dinner, though she suspected it was with Elena. Around midnight, a stabbing pain coursed through her lower abdomen. It came unexpectedly, more intense than any discomfort she had felt before. She gasped, nearly dropping her book. Sweat beaded on her forehead. She tried to recall Dr. White's instructions about contractions. Could it be false labor? The pain returned, sharper this time. Panic set in. She was only 36 weeks pregnant, a bit early but not dangerously so. Still, everything about it felt ominous. Catherine clutched her phone and dialed Alexander's number, her breath ragged. After several rings, he picked up. Alexander, she managed, wincing through the pain. I need you to come home. Something's wrong. I think I'm going into labor. He hesitated, his voice muffled by loud background noises, music, chatter, glasses clinking. Now, Catherine, I'm in the middle of something important. Have you called the driver or an ambulance? She swallowed hard, tears burning in her eyes. Have I called the driver? She repeated to herself, stunned by his indifference. Please, I'm scared. There was a long pause, as though he'd covered the phone to speak to someone else. Then, in a clipped tone, he said, I'll see what I can do. He ended the call. Catherine's heart pounded. She dialed the mansion's chauffeur, Martin, who always stayed on call. But to her dismay, Martin informed her that Alexander had taken the town car for the evening. The second driver was on leave for a family emergency. The pain cut through her again, so severe that it nearly brought her to her knees. Desperate, she fumbled through her contacts, finally reaching a friend who lived in Manhattan. But her friend was too far away to help quickly. Call an ambulance, her friend advised. I'll meet you at the hospital. Catherine did just that, summoning an ambulance that would arrive in about 15 minutes. Each minute felt like an eternity as the contractions grew stronger, her breathing ragged. She didn't realize she was weeping until she tasted the salt of her tears on her lips. She waited by the entrance, hugging herself in terror. Where was Alexander? Where was her husband, the father of her unborn child, at this critical moment? Just as she thought she couldn't be more devastated, her phone rang again. Still doubled over in pain, Catherine fished out her phone. She hoped it was Alexander, finally coming to his senses. But the caller ID made her stomach lurch. It was an unknown number. She answered, voice trembling. Catherine Morgan? An anxious voice asked. This is Dr. Gabriel White. I'm calling because your husband just rushed in with a woman. She's in labor. Catherine's mind reeled. What do you mean? She asked through clenched teeth. Dr. White sounded perplexed. Alexander Morgan arrived with Elena Parker. She's apparently pregnant, and it seems she's going into early labor as well. He told me to phone you and ask if you could come, but the rest of his words merged into an indecipherable roar in Catherine's ears. Alexander had refused to come home for her, his pregnant wife, but he was rushing to the hospital for Elena Parker, his mistress, who was also carrying his child. It was a betrayal so profound that Catherine couldn't breathe. Her legs threatened to collapse beneath her. She forced herself to inhale, remembering her own crisis. The ambulance sirens approached, and moments later, paramedics were lifting her onto a stretcher. As the ambulance sped away towards St. Joseph's Hospital, Catherine lay on the stretcher, tears streaming down her face. She clutched her belly, half in physical agony from the contractions, half in emotional torment from the revelation. She realized with nauseating clarity that Alexander had been leading a double life, two pregnant women, both in their final stages of pregnancy, both in need of him, and he had chosen Elena. By the time Catherine arrived at St. Joseph's, she was in full labor. Nurses rushed her into a delivery room while she begged to see Dr. White. It turned out he was occupied with another patient, Elena Parker, who was in the private suite next door. Catherine's friend from Manhattan, Alyssa, soon arrived, grabbing Catherine's hand and trying to calm her. The contractions intensified. Nurses gave Catherine an epidural to manage the pain, but her emotional turmoil was not so easily numbed. She kept hearing voices in the hallway, glimpsing the frantic movement of doctors. She wondered if Alexander was rushing between Elena's room and hers, but if he was, he never showed his face to Catherine. Hours crawled by in a haze of pain and heartbreak. Finally, Dr. White entered Catherine's room, looking harried but compassionate. You're doing well, he assured her. Just a bit more, and he was interrupted by a nurse whispering something in his ear. Doctor, White nodded gravely. "Excuse me," he said, rushing out again. Catherine guessed he was going back to Elena. The betrayal burned like acid in her throat. Before dawn broke, Catherine gave one last push, and a newborn's piercing cry echoed through the delivery room. Tears of relief and heartbreak streamed down her face. She was a mother, now a mother, in the loneliest sense imaginable. The nurse placed a baby boy in her arms. He was warm, fragile, blinking at the harsh hospital lights. In that instant, Catherine felt a surge of unconditional love, a fierce determination to protect him from the chaos that was his father. She asked if Alexander was outside. The nurse shook her head apologetically. Alyssa hugged her and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Catherine." A few hours later, as Catherine tried to rest, Dr. White returned to check on her. "Your baby is healthy," he said. "He's in the neonatal ward for observation, but he's fine." He paused. "Elena Parker had a baby girl. She's stable as well." Catherine's lips trembled. "And Alexander?" she asked, though she could guess. "He left about an hour ago. I believe he went home with Miss Parker's baby." She insisted on discharging early, and Alexander seemed very worried. The final blow. He had left Catherine alone in the hospital, but had escorted his mistress and their newborn daughter. Catherine felt like she was drowning in humiliation and sorrow. Catherine spent 2 days in the hospital. Alyssa stayed by her side, helping with everything from paperwork to baby care. Meanwhile, Alexander sent no messages, made no calls. A cold, paralyzing anger replaced Catherine's sorrow. She vowed that once she returned home, she would confront him directly. If he wanted a divorce, so be it. If he wanted to fight, she would fight back. She would not be a doormat any longer. When Catherine finally arrived at Winfield Manor, her newborn son swaddled in her arms. She felt a terrifying emptiness in the grand corridors. The staff seemed on edge, avoiding eye contact. Alma approached, offering to help Catherine get settled. "Mr. Morgan is in the study," she whispered. Catherine nodded, steeling herself. She handed her son to Alma, who cradled him gently. Summoning her courage, Catherine walked down the hall, each step echoing in her ears. She found the study door slightly ajar. Inside, Alexander sat behind his mahogany desk, his head bowed. Standing beside him was Elena Parker. The sight of them together in her home was a shock. Elena held a delicate baby girl, only days old. Catherine caught a glimpse of the infant's tiny face, a reflection of Alexander's strong features, and her stomach flipped with nausea. Alexander looked up, startled to see Catherine. "Catherine, you're back," he said lamely. She clenched her fists, her voice trembling with fury. "What is this, Alexander? I come home from the hospital, alone, after giving birth to our son, and find you here with your mistress and your other child in my house?" Elena shifted uncomfortably, her face pale. Alexander said, "We could stay here temporarily," she murmured. "I have nowhere else to go." Catherine laughed bitterly, tears pooling in her eyes. "You have nowhere else to go? You think that justifies any of this?" Alexander stood up, hands raised in a feeble gesture of peace. "Listen, Catherine, let's be rational. I didn't plan this. It just happened. Elena's baby was early. She needed me there. And you had the ambulance. You were taken care of. You think that excuses anything," Catherine shouted, her voice echoing off the ornate walls. "You left me in labor and rushed to her side. Do you realize how humiliating, how heartbreaking that is?" Elena began to cry, her tears streaking her makeup. "I'm sorry, but I love Alexander, and he loves me too." She looked at Alexander for confirmation. He said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Catherine's fury soared to new heights, but she also felt a deep sadness pulling her down. "Did you love me at all?" she asked quietly, voice quivering. "Or was I just some trophy wife you paraded around while you kept your real life hidden?" Alexander swallowed. "It's not like that. He hesitated, then let out a long breath. I care for you, Catherine, but Elena and we have a different connection. It began before you got pregnant. I'm sorry." Those words sliced through the last thread of hope Catherine held. She realized then that Alexander had made his choice. The love she thought they shared had been one-sided for far too long. She took a moment to gather herself, focusing on the bigger picture. Her son was in the arms of a loving maid, but she would not allow him to grow up in a toxic environment. "I want you to leave," Catherine said finally, her eyes filled with quiet fury. "Both of you, get out of Winfield Manor." Elena clutched her baby protectively. Alexander bristled, stepping forward. "This is my estate, Catherine. You can't just—" "I can," she interrupted. "The deed is in my name as well. Remember the vow we made after we got married? To share everything. If you don't leave willingly, I'll have you both removed. I have enough evidence of your affair to make your life miserable in divorce court. Believe me, Alexander, I will do it." A glimmer of fear crossed his face. He knew Catherine wasn't bluffing. Her father, Gerald, was a prominent attorney, and Catherine herself was no stranger to legal battles. Alexander stared at her, then at Elena, as though trying to balance loyalties. Finally he conceded. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll go for now, but this isn't over." Catherine stepped aside, allowing him to pass. She watched through teary eyes as Alexander and Elena left, carrying the newborn girl. The echo of the front doors, slamming shut, reverberated through the quiet halls, marking the end of one chapter of her life and the daunting beginning of another. In the days that followed, Catherine worked with her father's legal team to file for divorce. The media got wind of the scandal, and tabloids splashed headlines about the millionaire who abandoned his pregnant wife for his mistress. Rumors ran wild. Some alleged that Catherine knew about the affair all along and only acted the victim now, while others portrayed Alexander as a heartless playboy from the start. The truth was lost in the frenzy, but Catherine was too exhausted to care. Her priorities now were simple: to heal and to care for her son, James Morgan Beaumont. She added her maiden name, Beaumont, to his birth certificate, symbolically distancing him from the Morgan legacy. She revived her design business, Beaumont and Company, working from a home office while nursing her newborn. In the quiet of those early mornings, she drew strength from James's warm little face, his tiny hands gripping her finger. He was her future now, and she would not let him down. Support flowed in from unexpected places: fellow society women who had endured similar betrayals, old college friends who admired her bravery, even certain Morgan family acquaintances who quietly disapproved of Alexander's actions. Even the staff at Winfield Manor, like Alma, rallied around Catherine. She decided to keep the estate for James's inheritance, though she often wondered if it was cursed by the Morgan arrogance. Meanwhile, Alexander tried to maintain a relationship with James, though Catherine set strict boundaries. She allowed him supervised visits, primarily to ensure her son's safety and well-being. Each time he visited, Alexander would arrive in his luxury car, sporting designer suits, trying to project his old confidence. But Catherine noticed new shadows under his eyes, a weariness he couldn't hide. Elena's presence in his life and her demands had apparently complicated things further. Catherine felt no pity. It was a bed he had made for himself. One day, Alexander asked if he could speak with her privately. The divorce proceedings were well underway, and Catherine had no appetite for more drama. But curiosity and a sense of closure prompted her to agree. They met in the estate's sunroom, a bright space filled with potted palms and comfortable seating. Catherine held James, who now cooed and wiggled in her arms. Alexander sat across from her, hands clasped. For a moment, he looked more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "Catherine," he began, clearing his throat, "I know I've done horrible things. I was selfish, and I lied to you. I just want to say I'm sorry." She studied him, seeing the father of her child, once her husband, now a man she barely recognized. "Apologies don't change the past," she replied softly. He nodded, eyes downcast. I know, but it's important to me that you know I regret how I treated you. I never wanted to hurt you or James. She felt tears threaten to surface, but kept them at bay. I'm moving on, Alexander. I suggest you do the same. You have another family now with Elena. He inhaled sharply. Yes, but Elena and I. It's not what I thought it would be. She's threatened to take the baby if I don't financially support her. Everything's a mess. I realized too late that what I threw away was real. Catherine said nothing, only looked at the child in her arms. She thought of how she had endured labor alone, how she had faced betrayal after betrayal, how she had found the strength to keep living for her son. A piece of her pitied Alexander, but a larger part of her found it impossible to forgive. You made your choice, she said simply, standing up. Now you have to live with it. As the months went by, Catherine's divorce settlement was finalized. Despite the sensational headlines, Catherine managed to negotiate a substantial agreement that would secure James's future. She retained Winfield Manor, but opted to move into a smaller residence in Manhattan, a place she could more easily manage while working and caring for James. The estate remained in her name, used mostly for events or short weekend retreats. Alexander, meanwhile, faced a series of business setbacks. In part, these were caused by the negative publicity surrounding his personal life. Investors grew wary of his judgment. Elena's extravagant spending drained more of his finances than he had anticipated. Publicly, Alexander still maintained a veneer of success, but behind closed doors, cracks were forming. One day, out of the blue, Catherine received a phone call from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of her. The voice on the other line was timid. "This is Elena Parker." Catherine froze. Her heart pounded. "Why are you calling me?" There was a short pause. I'm sorry. I know I'm the last person you want to talk to, but I need your help. Alexander and we're in trouble." A surge of anger flared in Catherine. She nearly hung up. "After everything you both did, you have the nerve to ask for my help." But something in Elena's trembling voice gave her pause. "What sort of trouble?" Catherine asked, trying to remain calm. Elena explained that Alexander had been entangled in a business deal gone wrong, leaving them on the verge of financial ruin. Debt collectors were harassing them, threatening lawsuits. Elena feared for the safety of her daughter, Darcy. "I don't know what else to do," Elena pleaded. "Alexander won't ask for help, and I have nowhere else to turn. Please, Catherine, he's still the father of your child. If something happens to him, it affects all of us." Catherine closed her eyes, battling conflicting emotions. She wanted to tell Elena to deal with the mess on her own, but the reference to James made her pause. As much as she loathed Alexander for his betrayal, he was indeed James's father. If he ended up in prison or financially ruined, the stigma would indirectly affect James's life too. "Let me think about it," Catherine finally said, her voice cold. "I'll call you back." She hung up, her stomach twisting in knots. She had worked hard to rebuild her world, to carve out a new life for herself and James. Did she really want to get dragged back into Alexander's mess? Catherine scheduled a meeting with her father, Gerald Beaumont, to discuss the legal implications of helping Alexander. Over a cup of coffee in her Manhattan apartment, she laid out Elena's desperate plea. Gerald listened patiently. "Legally, you have no obligation," he said, "but morally, well, that's up to you. Alexander's misfortunes might cast a shadow on James's future. If you help him, you might ensure some stability. But if you do nothing and Alexander's empire collapses, that will certainly affect child support, among other things." Catherine wrestled with the decision for several days. Ultimately, she concluded that while she owed Alexander nothing personally, she had to consider James's long-term well-being. She decided to extend a measure of assistance, but with strict conditions. She would make a short-term loan to Alexander's failing venture, enough to stabilize it, on the legal condition that the funds were solely for business restructuring. She also demanded that Alexander sign an addendum to their divorce settlement, ensuring no further claims on her or James in case of future financial disasters. When she finally called Elena with the terms, she expected pushback or outrage, but the mistress only expressed gratitude. "Thank you," Elena breathed. "You're doing more than I deserve." Catherine couldn't disagree with that. She orchestrated a meeting in her attorney's office. Alexander showed up looking haggard, his once proud shoulders slumped under the weight of debt and regret. Elena stood by him, clutching their infant daughter. Catherine maintained a calm, businesslike demeanor as she explained the loan terms. Alexander avoided eye contact for most of the meeting, but when he finally looked at her, there was shame in his eyes. "I don't deserve this kindness," he said. "I know that." Catherine's gaze remained impassive. "Kindness? No, this is about responsibility. I'm only protecting our son and ensuring you don't drag him into your ruin." He nodded, signing the paperwork without hesitation. Over time, Alexander used the funds to reorganize his businesses, narrowly avoiding complete bankruptcy. The tabloids eventually moved on to other scandals, and Catherine's life grew increasingly settled. Her design firm flourished once again, and she found fulfillment in motherhood. Balancing work and parenting wasn't easy, but Catherine thrived on the challenge. Every evening she rocked James to sleep, reading him bedtime stories. His playful giggles were a reminder of what truly mattered. As for Alexander and Elena, their relationship grew strained under financial pressures and the lingering guilt of how they'd come together. Rumor had it that Elena left him a year later, taking their daughter elsewhere, though Catherine only heard these whispers in passing. Alexander's presence in James's life remained minimal, occasional visits, lukewarm attempts at fatherhood. Catherine neither encouraged nor obstructed these visits. If James wanted to see his father, she would not deny him, but she also wouldn't pretend that Alexander was a reliable figure. In a twist of fate, Catherine found herself at peace with the outcome. She had discovered a reservoir of strength. She never knew she possessed strength, born out of betrayal and heartbreak, channeled into rebuilding a life on her own terms. She had faced the ultimate humiliation of being forsaken in her hour of greatest need, but she had refused to be defined by that moment. Instead, she rose from the wreckage, determined to give her son every advantage in life. She wanted him to grow into a man who respected women, who stood by his commitments, who knew love was not to be trifled with. Years drifted by in quiet, steady transformation. What once was a grand stage of betrayal and heartbreak turned into a landscape of learning and growth for Catherine Beaumont. She'd learned to stop defining herself by the wounds of the past and, instead, shaped a fulfilling life around her passions, her son and the principles she clung to so fiercely: honesty, self-respect, and perseverance. In the aftermath of her divorce, Catherine decided to remain at Winfield Manor just long enough to ensure the property was well maintained and financially sound for her child's future. With help from her trusted friend Alyssa and loyal staff like Alma, she made the mansion presentable for exclusive events, charity galas, art exhibitions, and even high-profile corporate functions. Those events not only generated revenue, but also quietly recast the estate's reputation from a site of scandal to a beacon of sophisticated gatherings. Her growing design firm, Beaumont and Company, soon became the talk of Manhattan's high society. Catherine channeled her heartbreak into creative innovation. Intricate color palettes and daring furniture concepts reflected her personal journey from darkness into light. Prestigious commissions poured in, allowing Catherine to expand to London and Paris within 3 years. The initial fear that her personal scandal might ruin her career faded with each successful project. Her talent and professionalism spoke louder than any tabloid headline. Though balancing single motherhood with an expanding empire was far from easy, Catherine discovered a profound inner strength. Each morning she rose early to feed her son James, who beamed at her with bright eyes that reminded her of why she worked so hard. She would rock him in the glow of dawn, telling him gentle stories of faraway lands before diving into phone calls with international clients or scribbling design notes in her leather-bound planner. Even at such a young age, James seemed to sense his mother's love. He cooed and kicked with excitement whenever she cradled him in her arms. When James was old enough to toddle around, Catherine decided it was time to move from Winfield Manor into a more modest but beautiful townhouse in Manhattan. The manor, while grand, felt weighted with too many memories she wished to leave behind. She visited often for business events, but she craved a fresh start, an environment uncluttered by the haunting echoes of Alexander's betrayal. Her new home, a brownstone with tall windows and a cozy garden, became her sanctuary, a place she filled with bright paintings, minimal furniture, and photographs that captured her son's every milestone. In the swirl of these life changes, Alexander Morgan remained a distant figure. Their divorce settlement granted Catherine sole custody, though she allowed him scheduled visitation rights. In the early months, he arrived promptly for these visits, still wearing an air of forced confidence. He brought expensive gifts for James, tiny suits, overpriced toys, and gold-engraved keepsakes. Yet as time passed, his visits grew sporadic. Rumor had it that Alexander was struggling to keep his finances afloat amid ill-advised business deals and the public fallout of his affair. Catherine neither celebrated his misery nor welcomed him back into her life. She remained cordial but distant, setting boundaries to protect the stability and peace she had cultivated for herself and James. From time to time, Catherine heard murmurs about Elena Parker. She had apparently left Alexander not long after their daughter turned one, claiming the relationship was too burdensome and that Alexander was too unstable. Catherine felt a complicated tangle of emotions when she heard these whispers, part vindication, part sadness. She pitied Elena in a small way. They had both been caught in Alexander's web, though on opposite ends. Still, Catherine never reached out, believing she owed Elena nothing more than a distant wish that she might find her way forward. Amid these developments, Catherine focused on her deeper aspirations. She began mentoring younger women starting their own businesses, particularly single mothers who struggled to break into competitive industries. Her personal story made her an empathetic figure, and she found new purpose in giving others the guidance and support she once wished she'd received. She launched a foundation, Beaumont Future and Vision, which provided seed grants and workshops on financial planning, marketing, and design fundamentals. Seeing the spark in these women's eyes filled Catherine with a satisfaction that no amount of personal vengeance could ever replicate. Life also offered Catherine small windows of romance. She dated discreetly, meeting interesting men from diverse backgrounds, a Paris-based art curator who shared her love of modern sculpture, a venture capitalist from Silicon Valley who admired her drive and ingenuity. Each relationship was a lesson in trusting again, and though none developed into a lifelong commitment, Catherine never regretted opening her heart. She had learned to set firm boundaries, to demand respect for her time and her role as a mother, and to speak her mind without fear of judgment. James thrived in this atmosphere of love and careful structure. By his 4th birthday, he was a curious, bright-eyed boy, quick to notice details in the world around him, like how the sunlight patterned their living room floor or how the lines of a building curved against the sky. Catherine saw in him a budding artist's soul, perhaps inherited from her. She celebrated his talents, enrolling him in creative play classes and encouraging him to paint or draw whatever captured his imagination. Often, she found his little scribbles taped to the walls, rough shapes, crayon marks, and experimental colors. Each drawing felt like a gift, a promise that the future might still hold beauty and wonder, no matter what storms had torn through their past. In quieter moments, when James asked about his father, Catherine offered gentle truths. She explained that Alexander loved him in his own way, but had chosen a different path. She was careful never to fill James's young mind with bitterness or resentment. Life had taught her that hatred only weighed one down, and she refused to pass that burden to her child. Instead, she focused on hope and gratitude, the hope that James would grow up to be a compassionate, respectful man, and the gratitude that they had each other and more love than any betrayal could ever destroy. On one sunny afternoon in Central Park, Catherine watched James chase pigeons with squeals of glee. As she relaxed on a bench, she reflected on the woman she'd become, a far cry from the trembling wife who once begged her husband to drive her to the hospital. A gentle breeze caressed her face, and she inhaled deeply, savoring the moment. She was no longer haunted by the memory of that night when Alexander's betrayal loomed larger than anything else in her life. Instead, she felt the warmth of the sun, the beating of her own heart, and the unbreakable bond she shared with James. Catherine had come to understand that she didn't need revenge or validation from her ex-husband or anyone, for that matter, to find peace. She had spent years rebuilding, forging a life that was authentic and fulfilling, untainted by the scars of the past. Though the journey had been fraught with tears and turmoil, it led her to this serene moment. Watching James squeal in delight as a flock of birds took off into the bright sky, she realized that happiness, once so elusive, had found them after all. And in that instant, Catherine knew this was her true victory, a life defined by her own resilience, her son's laughter, and the unwavering conviction that even the deepest wounds could be transformed into a source of unexpected strength. The saga of Alexander Morgan and Catherine Beaumont Morgan is a chilling reminder that even wealth and prestige cannot shield us from betrayal and heartbreak. Love, trust, and family ties hang by delicate threads that can snap when selfish desires are allowed to run rampant. Yet in the aftermath of devastation, it's possible to rebuild stronger, wiser, and determined to protect what truly matters. If Catherine's journey taught us anything, it's the power of resilience and the importance of self-worth. No matter how dark the circumstances, hope and perseverance can pave the way to a brighter tomorrow. Thank you for joining us on this emotional roller coaster of shattered vows, hidden affairs, and newfound independence. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales. Your support means everything. Stay tuned for our next dramatic story.